everyone, and welcome back to the second webinar in the series, China's DeepSeek Moment. I am Lizzi C, a fellow on the Chinese economy at the Center for China Analysis here at ASPE, and I will be your moderator for today's discussion. Over the past few years, Huawei has defied many expectations. It was once seen as a casualty of US sanctions, but the company has reasserted itself as a driving force in China's tech ecosystem. Its Mate 60 Pro launch, allegedly powered by a domestically produced 7nm chip, has raised many questions about the effectiveness of US export controls and whether China is approaching another breakthrough moment in tech, similar to what we saw with DeepSeek's AI advances. So today we're asking, just how significant is Huawei's comeback? What does it say about China's innovation system and industrial policy? And what should Washington take away from this moment? To tackle these questions, I'm joined by an incredible panel of three experts. First, we have Kaiser Kuo, host of the Sinica Podcast. We have Paul Triolo, honorary senior fellow on technology at Center for China Analysis. And we have Peter Cowhey, Dean Emeritus at UCSD's School for Global Policy and Strategy. Thank you so much for being here. And Kaiser, I want to start with you. There's often this assumption in Washington that Huawei's success is purely a function of state support. But the reality seems to be more complex than that. And you've pointed out that Huawei's resurgence this time isn't just about government support. It's also about strong national backings from Chinese consumers. I wonder if you can sort of unpack that argument a little more and tell us something about how Huawei's brand has evolved in China's public imagination.
Well, thanks, Lizzie. That's a great question. I would say that more than any other company I can think of in China, it has really kind of mirrored or traced the broader economic and even geopolitical trajectory that China has gone through in recent decades. Huawei started off, I think, flying very much under the radar. After all, I mean, they were making PBX boxes, switching equipment for office buildings and stuff like that. Later, moving into the sort of the infrastructure of telecom networks, switching equipment. And nobody is going to become a household brand name making CDMA switching equipment, right? So in its early years, I think people who did know about it thought of it as a sort of a scrappy homegrown tech company that had really bootstrapped, what Chinese call 白手起家. It was admired certainly for outcompeting some big telecom giants, but mostly in international markets. And here it gets murky because, it did enjoy not direct state support, but it had, really, really deep lines of credit with Chinese state banks. And so it was able to offer real sweetheart deals. We'll build the network. You don't pay for it and, pay for it 2 years from now. It's fine. But I think people aren't aware of how little traction they had domestically. I think that when I was writing about them as early as 20 years ago, they had very little presence in core Chinese telecom networks, and they were losing bids despite being much cheaper to the old reliables, Ericsson and so forth. I think that their image really changed when they pivoted to consumer technology in the mid 2000s. So by the time I was living in China from 96 to 2016, but by the time I left, already they were well known as a major manufacturer of affordable and quite good handsets, with really good cameras and really fast refresh rates and all that stuff. It still hadn't become a consumer darling. I think that really changed, when geopolitics really enters the picture in a big way. We start to see, by 2019, when U.S. sanctions start to take hold, and especially with the arrest or the detention of Meng Wanzhou, who of course is not only the founder's daughter, but also the CFO of the company at the time. And then it really turned into a full-fledged national champion. Part of it was, this sense that it had been victimized, partially, and again, reflecting the greater national narrative. As soon as, semiconductor export controls start kicking in, even before, the Biden and Sullivan announcement in October of 2022, and then, the reboot in 23. You can sort of see, people are, Cheng Huawei, support Huawei. It becomes this sort of rallying cry. And of course, as you mentioned, with the release of the Mate 60 in 2023, with this really advanced Chinese-made chip, the device becomes, the company becomes a symbol of sort of resilience, that China could defy external constraints. And people were literally like tearing open the phone to analyze the chip and treating it like some kind of, precious artifact of geopolitical conflict. So it's not a company anymore. It's a kind of a political and cultural symbol. And I think that consumer nationalism has played a really, really big role in its resurgence. I wouldn't say that that is the reason for its success, but it has been able to deliver on technology, particularly in cloud computing and AI, with advanced chips. And I think it's continued to make sure that, with the release of, the trifold phones and things like that, that it's loyalty is still backed by genuine innovation. So yeah, that's what I would say about the trajectory.
Yeah, it's certainly been, an interesting couple more months for Chinese tech, right? We saw Alibaba stock surging for the past week, and CATL's massive Hong Kong IPO, Huawei's comeback, migration of TikTok refugees, so-called, to Xiaohongshu, DeepSeek's AI breakthrough. Kaiser, do you think these suggest that China tech is entering a new phase of renaissance or acceleration, or are we just reading too much into a few high-profile wins?
Well, I mean, it's hard to see them as entirely separate, but I think we have to be careful not to think that these are all telling exactly the same story. I mean, they are different. Each of these things that you've mentioned is in a different sector, really. I mean, Xiaohongshu's rise, this isn't something that speaks to China's technology, but what it has done is offered a window into China's technological development, and at a visible level. So a lot of Americans, I think, are recognizing this. And that has helped to bolster China's confidence in itself. There's this sort of boomerang effect. China still, I think, to this day, derives quite a bit of comfort in knowing that it is admired, that its successes are finally being recognized. And that, along with, of course, DeepSeek and Huawei's comeback, the gigantic CATL IPO, and of course, China's just jaw-dropping successes in electric vehicles. These things have all kind of now come together, and it bolstered confidence at a time where I think China was sort of in danger of succumbing to pessimism. So while they are distinct, I think they have really helped dispel what was, I think, becoming a drag on innovation, which is this creeping sense of defeatism. And I think there was this psychological shift. It's going to be, I think, the most consequential of these things. Confidence, I think, it really begets risk taking. It begets interest in investment from abroad and from domestic investors. Risk taking and, of course, money begets breakthroughs. And in that sense, I think these aren't isolated successes. Together, they actually do give China quite the shot in the arm. I think the worry is that this kind of confidence can shade into hubris. I think we've already seen a little bit too much nationalist triumphalism in some quarters. If confidence translates into a pragmatic determination to keep pushing forward, that's one thing. And if it turns into kind of this assumption that China is somehow immune to structural constraints, whether we're talking about semiconductors, and export controls, in AI, in capital markets, I think it could lead to complacency at exactly the moment when more clear-eyed strategy is needed.
Fantastic. Paul, just going back to Huawei, I wanted to talk a little bit about Huawei's AI ambitions. Huawei has announced its integration of DeepSeek's AI models into its own Ascend AI infrastructure. Just how significant is this? Does this partnership with DeepSeek indicate that China is, finding ways to circumvent AI chip restrictions by potentially developing a fully sufficient, software hardware loop, finally closing that loop, Paul?
Well, look, this is a complicated issue. So obviously, as Kaiser noted, I mean, Huawei has been sort of evolving its focus, over the last decade, right? I mean, we used to think of Huawei as 5G, 3G, 4G, 5G, 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G. And then, Huawei at some point decided that it wanted to be in the semiconductor design game. And so it began designing chips for all of its major product lines. I remember being in Shenzhen at Huawei headquarters with a very senior Huawei official, and they led me into this display room that showed proudly all of their high silicon designs semiconductors for each of their product lines, right? And that included cloud, that included base stations and smartphones, and then eventually the GPU, right, or the server chips, the Ascends that were in GPU. So they've been doing that for a long time, and Huawei has been trying to develop not just the hardware, of course, but the full stack, if you will, of AI, suite of AI tools and software tools and development environments, which we can get to. And then, of course, you have recently this emergence of DeepSeek, right? And then now we've been learning what DeepSeek did to achieve some of its technology breakthroughs and innovations. But it's important to remember, DeepSeek was the small company, 100 people, young. Most of these kids are in their 20s, early 20s or teens, coming out of this hedge fund. And this was not a government, my money quote is, I think that, the emergence of DeepSeek surprised the bureaucrats in Beijing just as much as it did the bureaucrats in Washington and the industry people in the Valley, right, who hadn't really, I mean, and again, we have to be careful. Most people who are following the industry knew about DeepSeek. I think it was a combination of factors in December and January that led to this sudden focus on DeepSeek and the $1.2 trillion market correction that DeepSeek caused. But it was within the Chinese AI industry. It was known as an innovative company, but again, very small. Not necessarily trying to do more than it was trying to do, not necessarily part of any grand scheme to develop a Chinese AI stack. But after the emergence of DeepSeek, then I think the DeepSeek and now Huawei sort of people are begin thinking of them as part of an overall effort that it has many pieces to it, and some of it was in train and some of it maybe more new, to in fact develop some alternative to the sort of NVIDIA dominated AI stack here, right? And so there's many pieces to that. So for example, one of the things that DeepSeek did, which was very interesting, and I covered this on my Substack, was use low-level programming techniques to optimize GPU to GPU transfer rates. Now, if you remember, that metric, GPU to GPU transfer rates, was one of the things the US government focused on initially in controlling advanced GPU exports to China. So for example, in October 2022, the parameter of concern was this GPU to GPU transfer rate, which was set at a certain level, 4,800, I'm trying to remember the actual metric they used there, 4,800 flops. It was a very specific to the NVLink, which is a proprietary NVIDIA technology that they use to interconnect their GPUs, and then NVIDIA designed a chip quickly, right? Much to the consternation of Secretary Raimondo and others in the Commerce Department, that was just under that threshold, right? And so that's what DeepSeek, those H800s, is what DeepSeek used to train the V3 and R1 models. They may have used other GPUs, which we can talk about, but I think that's what they primarily used. And they optimized those communication channels by doing this low-level programming and using NVLink sometimes and InfiniBand other times. So they basically overcame that downgrading of the GPU to GPU transfer rate that NVIDIA had been forced to do by US export controls. And then, of course, the next year, the US changed the metric to total processing power and total processing density. And so that meant that it was the GPU to GPU transfer rate was not the metric, but the H800 has to be viewed in that way. So DeepSeek's innovation was, hey, and this has always been kind of known too, right? For things like GPU to GPU transfer rate and optimizing the workload, AI workloads on those GPUs, you can program if you know how to program the hardware more directly, you can overcome, for example, the lack of this CUDA architecture, which NVIDIA has been so critical to NVIDIA's success, which is a series of libraries. It's well developed. It's been, many, many years, and developers know how to use it, but it sort of divorces the developers from the hardware. So they don't have to do that really low-level programming, right? But if you have really smart people who can do that, you can overcome some of those difficulties and optimize certain parts of things like training, large language models at the hardware level. So that's what. So the significance of DeepSeek is that they know how to do that. So already there's rumors that that Huawei is gonna provide 32,000 Ascend processors to allow DeepSeek to train its next model, right? And optimize. And we'll work with DeepSeek to optimize the hardware and presumably the GPU to GPU transfer rate. So those GPUs will be, will be usable and will be, again, not exactly the same as NVIDIA. Certainly, those Ascends, for example, are probably roughly like an A100 chip, but interestingly, because of DeepSeek's capability, probably if they optimize the entire fabric of GPU to GPU transfer rate, they can probably have a cluster that functions somewhere near an H100 level cluster, right? And that's maybe the way to think about it. And then the US, when people say, well, the US export controls didn't work, well, of course they did work. They forced Huawei and DeepSeek into this other type of innovation and figuring out ways to optimize existing hardware. But then we have the next step, for example, up to Blackwell, which is really a significant step up in performance. And it's the big question then is how does the Chinese whole AI sector and industry and Huawei and DeepSeek, how do they come together potentially again, or breakthroughs at SMIC and developing the next generation of GPUs, working with Huawei to get to that level. Now there's a time lag in all this, right? I mean, those H100s have only been around a couple of years. They're still they still represent the vast majority of workloads. So all the models being trained now, for example, and for the next, potentially year, are going to be using those H100s. The Blackwells are just starting to come off the production line at TSMC, and they won't be in full use because it takes time to build these clusters, for example, that Elon is building in Memphis and others are building in the US of 50 or 100,000 or more GPUs. So in a sense, China, having access to Ascends and also all the other number of NVIDIA GPUs still, because there was stockpiling done during those years of 2022, 2023, 2024. They're going to be able to do a lot with that hardware for the next year or two before. And again, this is the argument of the proponents of export controls, that the U.S. export controls finally kick in and China can't get access to, for example, to the Blackwell status or level of GPU, and that's going to make a big difference. Now that's still, we can debate whether that's what that means, whether that's true or not. But for now, DeepSeek has sort of highlighted the fact that you can there are ways to innovate that enable a company like DeepSeek to put out really sophisticated and advanced models, particularly, and then the open source part of it is really important too. That's the other part we should talk about, which is, wow, open source is a huge issue. I was just in the Paris AI Action Summit, and we talked all about open source, and that's in terms of safety and how that figures into safety, but that's a huge issue. But so for the moment, DeepSeek and Huawei are proving that that China can do things differently, but in a way that will enable the companies that are involved in the sector in China to continue to innovate and build advanced models.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Paul. And speaking of safety and security, Peter, I want to turn to you. As Huawei currently expands beyond telecom to AI and cloud computing, what are the new security risks that are emerging, and how should policymakers address these new risks?
Well, let me perhaps, after Paul's excellent exposition, start from the grounding of the first focus on Huawei, which was about telecom network security, and ask how that risk factor helps us understand this evolving risk factor. And in that initial effort to keep Huawei out of telecom networks, we had a kind of a finger in the dike strategy. Yes, there were specific risks that might be tied to Huawei network equipment, but the larger problem from day one was that networks themselves in an internet era are interlinked, they are global in the movement of data, and the software in the network defines much of the performance and access to the network. So you could take out all the Huawei equipment and still have a very vulnerable network. We've just been reading about that with Salt Typhoon being emerged. Where's the biggest problem that is most recently identified? It's in Cisco software, in routers, with a fault that was identified in an update from Cisco in October of 2023, and yet many of the networks and internet providers and individual large user conglomerations, like research university campuses in the US, didn't change their software, which is typical, I might add, of how large software complexes operate. And so plugging this hole that we saw with Huawei was not actually addressing the problem of network security as the puck was moving in the long term. All right. Our success rate with getting rid of the Huawei network was essentially that we got our closest allies to eventually pull Huawei, at least most of them with most of the hardware. But it did nothing about the fact that the growth of the network and of now the computational links to the network, let's call them cloud computing clusters around the world, is in a mixed environment where there are not only Chinese cloud providers, but even in the places where the Americans are either directly operating, let's say Amazon, or American firms that will build your cloud capabilities to your specifications, you now have a mixed security arrangement and you have data flowing everywhere. So to understand what the Huawei evolution now opens up is that it's an intensification of the fact that basically information movement and computational capabilities for reasons of redundancy, for customer specifications, and for the fact that we still live in a global economy means that the only type of security that you have that is really fundamental is the type of security that the US through the National Institutes, the NIST efforts, are really pushing with the idea of zero risk models of networking, where the emphasis is on early detection of breaches, fast response times, and redundant capabilities. Now that's easier said than done, but it's important to recognize it can be done, and we have already hardened significant parts of critical infrastructure networks, not big public utilities, which are a total mess, but in places like key defense industry suppliers, this is being done already. And the question is how to scale that up and make work better. Now, to my mind, this thing that we should watch most about this Huawei operation, aside from the questions about whether it will further boost the AI capabilities of China, is the operating system. Because fundamentally, as Paul started to suggest with the alternatives to the NVIDIA stack, what Huawei is proposing is the equivalent to something like Android in the long time. And that raises the question of what do we think about that as a security risk and a response to it, because we're not going to stop it. And we know that Huawei is a very capable set of engineers underneath this marketing and low-cost machine. So I'll turn it back to you at that, but maybe we can explore that a little bit more.
I just want to say, great comments, Peter. I just think it's really important to foot stomp that what U.S. officials are characterizing as by far the worst cyber penetration of U.S. critical infrastructure ever was done with no Huawei equipment anywhere in sight, right? I think that's a really important point to make. The British, it gets back to a point I've been making for years, which is the British, for example, took the approach that it shouldn't matter who makes any of the equipment. The operators, in this case, it shows pretty clearly, the carriers and the operators of those networks need to implement security protocols, update software, et cetera. And that's the really important thing. And it should be that approach to network security should be equipment agnostic, right? And I think this sort of proves that the UK approach has probably been the correct one all along, and the focus on Huawei equipment in the networks may have been misplaced, because and most of the breaches that we've seen too, even previous to this, take place, way above the hardware level in the cloud, right? And not in terms of exploiting individual pieces of hardware. So this is a lesson, I think, that's critical to learn here, that the security issues around the networks and AI and other issues, cloud services, they have to be thought about very carefully, and an approach that sort of targets equipment based on country of origin may not be the optimal way.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Paul, for the comments. So, Peter, I wanted to turn back to you. I think you already alluded to that the U.S. current approach to critical technologies might have some shortcomings, and Paul, you also alluded to this. So Peter, what kind of policy tools beyond export controls should Washington consider? What's a better set of tools to address the security concerns that you raised?
So, first of all, having done a couple of presidential administrations, I always watch this tendency to take a specific problem and blow it up to cover everybody's rice bowl. And that's kind of what happened here. Huawei represented a particular niche problem in the system. It was something you could identify much easier than the whole software system being updated in some ways. And then it grew into an expanded goal. Now, today, let's take the question of the original purpose, which was the fight over 5G. And let me use that to illustrate it then to the broader area. So the original response after we tried to pull Huawei equipment and yet recognized it wasn't going to happen everywhere, and that we didn't have a really good alternative, was that we were going to support open radio access networks, an alternative architecture for 5G. And as an architecture, that was a perfectly good idea. As a matter of fact, it fed into exactly what the US does best, which is create a more decentralized architecture for information communications technology and allow specialized firms to emerge who will own particular pieces of the outfit and innovate and scale in ways that we understand in the American system. But open RAN systems pose the problem that as a network, they posed a brand new technology, and the big telecom networks are shells of themselves. They don't have R&D capacity. They don't really have the same type of capital investment capacity they did in the past. And so it posed the point that although all the big telecom networks, for example, in the US said they like open RAN, none of them were willing to spend big on it. It was up to somebody else. So here's the lesson. Faced by that, the question was, who would write the check or the guarantee of the performance of this alternative architecture? That if it scaled in a place like the US or some other big market, would then be, as a sense, an alternative to Huawei and introduce a different system of innovation, okay? And the US got caught in an internal fight between the antitrust authorities and the national security authorities, because the antitrust authorities basically were nervous about big telecom platforms that becoming digital technology platforms. Let's read places like Google and Microsoft, et cetera. And so on antitrust grounds, they opposed those companies becoming the people who wrote the check to guarantee the new network deployment. And the thing to understand here is that for those companies, telecom equipment was not a high value market in itself. It was like Google fiber optic networks. Google doesn't make money off its fiber optic networks. It enables its core technologies to be spread and used more broadly. And that was the proposition for Open RAN. But the antitrust authorities basically said, no, we can't do that. You saw Lina Khan giving speeches about digital national champions. So my first suggestion is pretty simple, that in the future of antitrust, if it exists in the Trump administration, that we think about the market definitions for big digital tech no longer as the US, but global, with a US component and a global component. And once you understand that, you start to recognize that we're not operating in a world that the US owns. And then you've got to start asking about competition issues and about things that you might want to pinpoint for very specific problems, but allow for a different type of mixed capitalization and technology deployment system. The second thing that I think that we need to do to deal with the broader issue is to recognize that we have let our ambitions about technology controls that you heard Paul and Kaiser talk about so well grow out of proportion. The original purpose of the semiconductor controls for the leading edge of applications was to keep the very bleeding edge somewhat with an advantage for the US to the degree that semiconductors could allow that. We'll turn that into a general idea of we had to move down the stack to save a much broader area of the industry. I think we should revert to that original concern and start to ask, what are the things at the bleeding edge that we need, and what's the R&D system that goes with it? And here's one just to think about. Updating software in a large cloud-based system on a global basis is hard to do. One of the reasons they don't do it is it's clumsy, it's slow, and it often produces all sorts of complexities. So why don't we invest in R&D that basically is designed to facilitate software network upgrades that are secure? There are technologies that could do that we could certify and press our allies to use in cloud centers that want to also serve US customers. Not that hard, and it doesn't necessarily exclude the Chinese. This is the type of thinking we need. It's skating to where the technology horizon is and recognizing that our ability to control the global technology ecosystem is diminished.
Fantastic. Paul, any follow-up thoughts on that?
No, I think Peter's really good. I really enjoy listening to his comments. I think those are really constructive. But yeah, these are complicated issues and need the kind of sustained attention that they sometimes don't get between administrations. That's one of the challenges of the system.
Fantastic. And Kaiser, I want to revert back to you a little bit. Speaking of China's system of innovation, clearly very different from the US's market-driven approach, but you've pushed back on this idea, which I hear a lot, which is political openness is necessary for innovation. But are there structural limitations to China's current approach? Can China's model actually sustain long-term innovation, or will inefficiencies and constraint eventually slow it down? Are we just taking a too short view on sort of China's brief success in tech breakthroughs? What's your view on the long term?
Yeah, I think there's a sort of maximalist position of this idea that I think we saw, a decade or so ago on the campaign trail. Carly Fiorina, who was running for president at that point, and Joe Biden, who was vice president, were both talking about. I think they were espousing a sort of maximalist kind of chest-thumping version of this that said that political liberties were not just a necessary condition, but were kind of a sufficient condition for sustained innovative advantage. That to me seems like folly and hubris. What I think I would push back on the idea even that they are at a basic level necessary conditions. I think we're going to have to look too far into our historical past to see examples of this. Even before China came along, I mean, who, after all, invented what liberal democratic regime created the V-2 rocket, right? What was the liberal democratic regime that launched the first artificial satellite? I mean, as unfortunate as it is and is counter to a fundamental American narrative, a very comforting one, it's not true. I think China was I think finally the case that may have finally maybe broken that idea permanently. But I don't think that just because democracy isn't a prerequisite doesn't mean that China's current model is without structural limitations. I mean, I think that they show up later. They show up, at that bleeding edge. I think that the question is whether its innovation ecosystem, the Chinese innovation ecosystem, which still operates, with a highly centralized political system at some levels, and with extensive state intervention, is that able to sustain the kind of long-term paradigm shifting innovation that I guess we need to stay at the forefront of global technology? I think the jury is still very much out on that. So I mean, China's system clearly has strengths. I mean, the state has the capacity to mobilize resources at an extraordinary scale. They can set national priorities. They can through management of subtle things that people don't really quite understand, just KPIs for local politicians. They can end up directing capital toward their goals. They can set up, in 5-year plans and in national technology strategy policy documents, Fengkou, these sort of wind tunnels that, people know where to set their sail. They know that, the land in front of this wind tunnel will be cleared of many regulatory obstacles. They will enjoy favorable tax regimes if they set their sail there and sail with the winds that the party is going to provide. There are a lot of really clever things that China has done. I think that just simply willing a comparable American industrial policy into existence, by the way, one that follows on basically no national conversation about this is just going to be a colossal waste. But, I mean, you have to look at China's got a lot of things going for it. It's got a vast domestic market and a growing one. We like to, self-soothe by talking about the perennial lack of Chinese consumption. But, I've been there a lot recently. I think there's a lot of excitement about domestically produced Chinese technology goods. China still has world-leading companies and has pioneered entirely new business models in fintech and e-commerce and in AI applications. That isn't to say there are no constraints. There are definitely constraints, but they are not just about this flattened idea of, democracy versus authoritarianism. They are about, structural inefficiencies that emerge in a system where, political considerations they weigh heavily on economic and technological decision makers. There's no question about that. I mean, there's the whole risk aversion that we've seen creep in, when political loyalty or fear of, of political pressure is present. When it's placed above competence, for example, in promotions, in environments where you see people, defer to central authority, where, mid-level bureaucrats and business leaders tend to hesitate, instead of making bold moves. That's a problem. This is something that the Chinese leadership is very much aware of, and they're trying to address. I think that what we have to resist is this essentializing idea that, well, the Chinese pedagogical tradition, their system, the rote memorization, the obedience that children must give to parents and authority figures, that is what is keeping China down. That we have to avoid that. We should really look more at the actual structures and the way that things actually play out. I think there's a lot of really a lot of copium in this dismissal of Chinese innovative capability, and a lot of, like I said, self-soothing.
Thank you so much, Kaiser. And I should mention one book I find particularly helpful in helping me understand Huawei's, history with interactions with the Chinese, unique political and bureaucratic system is Washington Post journalist Eva Dou's book, House of Huawei, especially early history of Huawei. Well, that brings us to the end of today's discussion. A huge thank you to Kaiser, Paul, and Peter for sharing your insights, and to all of you in the audience for joining us. It's clear that Huawei and China's broader tech push are raising a lot of big questions, and we'll be following those developments closely here at Center for China Analysis. If you'd like to dive deeper, please make sure to check out our latest reports and project here at CCA, and of course, follow our panelists' work for their ongoing insights. Thanks again, and see you at our next event.
Thanks, Liz.